several of the folks that were here. I'd like to introduce to you my better half, and by all means, she is my better half, Liz Peterson. We just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary last December. And so I know for all of you that live in Brodhead, the fact that I could have lived with anyone, or anyone could have lived with me for 50 years, it brings a smile to your face. I understand. And I'm happy to see so many of the old Southside grocery employees here. By old, I mean both chronologically, and they used to work for Dad and Mom and Dad, so that was nice. And so that's going to be, it's going to be a fun night, a night of reminiscing, I think. I hope I'm going to challenge you with some things that you knew about, that you did not know about Mom and Dad, that will bring them up in your mind. A little bit about what they did when the chips were down and things were tough and they had things to do. I'm going to give you some background of the grocery stores that you will never have known. And I'm going to talk about some people in Brodhead who made a difference with Mom and Dad when others wouldn't. And so I'm not going to mention any names, good or bad, so don't worry about that. But I do want to recognize, I know that we've got a number of people that work for Mom and Dad here. If you did, would you please raise your hand if you work for my family? Very nice, thank you. A number of folks that are here work for Mom and Dad.
I was free labor though.
You were free labor. Free labor. So I'm going to start this in the way I've always thought about starting a presentation, which has nothing to do with the presentation. But we're going to do it anyway, so hang on. Get everyone in. Say what it is, sir, open the gate up and welcome, boys. Here comes lot of number 29. What are we going to give for? A $25 bid, not $30. 30, will you give me 30? Make a 30 bid about a $30. Who will give me 30? Who will give me $30 bid? There you go. That's enough. I always wanted to do that, and you're the always. So, there you go. So let me give you a story about the Southside Grocery, and I'm going to start with Mom and Dad, where they were born, what their families were like, where they came from, how they got to Brodhead in 1950, a lot of things about how the old Southside Grocery in 1950 had come about, and then we're going to go on from there. But I expect that some of you that used to work for Mom and Dad, that you may have a story or two, and by all means, I want you to tell the stories. So if you would do that, that'd be great. So my able scribe over here is starting. And if you can see the picture here, this is the picture that's behind me of the three grocery stores. The one that was built in that came about in 1950, that's the old Southside Grocery. While you're looking at that picture, if you look up above where the sign Southside Grocery is, that used to be my bedroom. And so for the first 2 years that we lived in Brodhead, we lived above the grocery store. And so as you look at that grocery store, if you look off to the right, let's see, my right, your left, whatever that is. As you look off that way, you're going to see some tables out there with watermelons and potatoes and other kinds of things on it. We didn't have enough room in the store to keep fruit or vegetables, and so all the fruit and vegetables were kept outside on the tables outside. Now imagine that. Nobody came to take them. Nobody did anything like that. It was just, that's how people kept things, and that's what happened. Jim, over here. Got chairs. And to put this,
it's not working.
And to put this into perspective, Greg Condon has made a diorama of that building. It's sitting on the table up here. And we talked about it a year or so ago. I talked to Greg, and he said he was building it. We began to talk about the people that were in the diorama. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the people that were involved with the Southside Grocery as it began. Now, As we move from this slide was presented to Mom and Dad when they built the brand new Century Store. And so it listed the employees at the Century Store at the time. And so we'll go through that in a minute. My dad was born in Fort Atkinson in 1921, and he worked for a man by the name of Cully Frank. And Dad started in the grocery business when he was not old enough to work. So he was 9 or 10 or 11 years old, and he would go down to the grocery store that Cully Frank owned. And at the time, for those of you who remember years ago in the grocery business, when you would get in a bushel basket full of apples or a box of oranges, they would all be wrapped in kind of tissue paper. So every one of them you'd have to take apart and take the tissue paper and throw it away, and you'd then stack the orange and the apple, and that's what you did. And so that's what Dad did, was he stacked oranges at Cully Frank's grocery store. Until Cully Frank found out how old he was and he kicked him out. And it wasn't very nice, but that's what he did. Dad also worked as what was called a scrapper at the time. And a scrapper was a guy that took tin and metal and other items. And Dad had a bicycle that he rode all over Fort Atkinson at the time, and he picked up scrap materials, and he took them to Louis Lorman's scrapyard. And so he was known as a scrapper. And that's how he bought the first bicycle tires. Now, the tires used to be different than we look at them today, but he had the old balloon tires on his bike, and he paid $10 for the balloon tires on his bike, and that's how he was able to go all throughout the community and pick up scrap to take to Louis Lorman's. My mom was born a year later in Watertown, Wisconsin, 1922, and Mom grew up working in a shoe factory. And I don't know how many of you know about what your parents or grandparents did, how they made money when they were young, but that's how my mom helped support their family. And you're going to see a picture here of both families. That family is my dad's, and you'll see my dad was the tallest member of his family. And my mom's is on the other side. And they both had 8 children in the families. Normal at that time, 8 kids in the family, and that's what you did. And so my grandfather on my mother's side worked as a chair caner. Does that make sense? It's a chair caner. That's what you used to have on the basis of where you sat on chairs. He was a caner, and so he would work as a chair caner. And when he wasn't doing that, he would work as a shoemaker. Mom, Liz's mom, was a stay-at-home mom, and she was both of them came from Europe and emigrated through Ellis Island to come to America. They both lived about 60 miles apart from each other in Yugoslavia. And what was interesting was they didn't meet until they came to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And they lived 60 miles apart from each other and married. And my mother is the tall one on that far side of the... So my mom and dad were both tall. My mom was 5'11", dad was 6'4", so they were both tall. They met in Watertown, and Dad was enamored with this young lady, and so they began to date. So if we move on. I told you that Cully Frank was the owner of the grocery store. This was from 1940s that Cully Frank and his wife celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. And so this is the guy that Dad worked for, and this is the guy that kicked Dad out of the store. I thought it was pretty neat that they kicked him out of the store. They were married on November 22nd, 1941. For those of you that remember the date, do you remember anything that happened on November 22nd? Kennedy's assassination. And so on November 22nd, 1963, Mom and Dad had a very bad anniversary that year.
It's also John's birthday.
John's birthday. Dad enlisted in the Navy, and we're going to talk a little bit about his Navy career. Mom moved to Florida with him and then stayed in Florida for the duration of the war with a guy that a lady and a couple that you'll see here in a moment. Dad was discharged in 1946, and they returned to Monroe, Wisconsin, where Dad managed the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company store, or the E&P store. And then I was born in 1948. So these are some pictures of Dad in the Navy and Mom. If you look at the one on the far right, far right, your left.
Yeah, that's right.
I can get there. It just takes a minute. On the far left, Dad is with a guy by the name of Fred Grimes and his wife, Babe. And that's who Mom stayed with during the war in Florida. And the picture, the Navy picture that you see of Dad is the picture that he gave to Mom when he went off to war. And the picture on the right from my mom is the picture she gave to my dad as he went off to war. And so you see that. Dad was on a ship called the Patrol Craft Escort Rescue. So for those of you that look on the table over there, you're going to see a book, two of them actually, on the Patrol Craft Escort Rescue. And this ship was a shallow draft ship, and so by shallow draft, it could go into the beach where other ships couldn't go. And so what the purpose of this boat was, or ship was, Patrol Craft Escort Rescue, was to rescue wounded soldiers from the beaches and take them either to the hospital ship, send them back to shore, or to bury them at sea. And so my dad, during the war, saw an awful lot of tragedy. And so I want to put some of that into perspective as we look at this. Dad had a beard at the time. He was one of the tallest guys on the ship. And so you'll see a couple of pictures of Dad in the Pacific and with the guys. On the far left, you're going to see a picture of a kamikaze pilot that Dad's ship found in the Pacific, and they saved him in the Pacific. So he was shot down, kamikaze pilot, and I'm going to read more about that to you in a second. And when he was brought to the ship, a number of the folks on the ship said, "Kill him." They screamed, "Kill him." And they didn't. And they kept him alive as a prisoner of war because that was the thing you were supposed to do. I need you to know that. Yeah, that's different because I'm going to read to you in a moment. Dad's ship was under kamikaze attack for 8 straight months. Now, for any of you that didn't know anything about World War II, what do you remember about kamikazes? What did they do? They were given a half a plane load of fuel. You could only do one thing. You could go out into the Pacific, you could crash your plane into a ship and have a glorious death, or you could land in the middle of the sea and nobody would ever know who you were again. And so kamikazes were really a difficult group to have involved. But let me back up just a second to bring to you when Dad first got to the ship. Could you hold this for me while I read that? This is one of the books that I was talking about.
Oh, this, all right. Aren't your eyes open?
This is what happened when they did their shakedown cruise of the Patrol Craft Escort 852. Prior to arriving in the Pacific, the 852 was berthed in Bermuda for training, and it was assigned to transport a load of German prisoners from Bermuda to Norfolk, Virginia. The prisoners were the crew of a German U-boat which had been captured intact by the United States Navy. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Let me take it forward. En route to Norfolk, the prisoners, the 852, encountered the worst storm of its career. The ship's motion was so violent that it was almost impossible to stand up or walk. The one moment the ship would be standing on its fantail with its bow clear of the water, and the next second, just the reverse, with the bow diving straight down to the bottom. Dr. Malott, the ship's physician, restricted all off-duty personnel to their bunks for their own safety. The German prisoners were being housed in the sick bay and guarded by Marines armed with machine guns. The second day of the storm, Dr. Malott went forward to check on the prisoners. Navigating his way aft through the passageways, where it seemed possible at times to walk over the bulkhead or the bulkheads, he was thrown first against one bulkhead and then another. When he reached the sickbay area, Dr. Malott, looking down the passageway, saw a German prisoner holding a machine gun and bending over a Marine guard. The Marine guard was hopelessly seasick, throwing up in a bucket while the German prisoner held his gun for him. Now, to put that into perspective, if you've ever been to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and when you go there, you're going to see a German U-boat, the U-505. That was the crew from the 505. So you know that at least there was some portion of history that was there, that they were involved in at the very beginning of the war. And on the German U-505, they found the Enigma machine, which was the beginning of the decoding of German messages for World War II. So, you know somebody that played a role in that, and that's kind of neat. And you'll see these two books that were written about the U-505, or about the PCR 852. And also on the table over there, you'll see Dad with his ship's crew in 2003 laying a wreath at the tomb of Harry Truman in Independence, Missouri, where the ship's crew went down to pay homage to Harry Truman because their ship would have been one of the first ships going into Japan if there was an invasion, in order to take folks off the beaches. That puts a lot of perspective on somebody coming to Brodhead in 1950. And there were a lot of people like that in Brodhead in 1950 that had similar stories. But I didn't know that you ever knew that about my dad. And how proud a son can be of his father for doing something like that. Dad didn't talk about the war at all with me all through 1950, and even into the 1960s, never mentioned his time in service. But they brought in an 8-month period of time, more than 1,000 wounded soldiers onto their ship that they took off in one way or another. They saw carnage that we could only dream about. So that puts into perspective this, and I do have these notes that are declassified by the War Department about Dad's ship and about what happened. And I would just read to you just this one paragraph so you have some perspective. This ship has been in contact, this comes from the War Department. This ship has been in contact continuously for the past 8 months, participating successfully in the operations at Leyte Gulf, Luzon, and Okinawa. It has been over 8 months since this ship is tied up to a dock. It's been more than 8 months since any of the crew have been off the ship for more than a few hours. It has been 8 months since the ship's company has spent a night free from the threat of enemy air attack. This ship saw the very first suicide attack by enemy-launched planes 8 months ago and has been exposed to them continuously since that time. And so, as we think about the people that came to Brodhead then, and even the people that come to Brodhead today, we don't know their backgrounds, we don't know what's happened. But I can tell you from knowing what I know about Dad and reading in these books, that, my goodness, there was a lot that they experienced on our behalf. So we're all here today, but there's a lot that they experienced that we would never know. So, lots of reason for them to be the greatest generation. All right, so in the 1950s, so let's come to the grocery store. So Dad's now been managing the A&P store. He hears that Stan Jones owns a grocery store in Brodhead. Stan is now moving down to Florida, would like to spend time down to Florida. Dad comes up, they talk, and Dad buys the grocery store from Stan Jones, the one you see in the top picture behind me. And that you saw before, where we live in the grocery store, above the grocery store for the first couple of years. We lived above the store for the first 2 years. The phone number, for any of you that remember, was 6. 6, please. It was a different day, folks. You don't have to punch in 24 numbers in order to know where you're going. There were other grocery stores in town at the time, and I don't know that I remember all of them, but the ones I do remember, Bill Bellman's grocery store was where the Bank Brodhead is. Engel's grocery store was on the corner across the street from the Bank of Brodhead. There was the Royal Blue store. Olson's store, that was at Northside Grocery, was Olson's store, Stairs Century, and then Curlis's Lager Plant. So there were a lot of different places that you were here in the 1950s, and there were a lot of different places where you could go shopping. And then my sister Sue was born in 1952. And so that brings you up to speed, and you're going to see some pictures with these. So you see the journey beginning with 1950 here in the Southside Grocery. What you see here on the whatever side it's on. For me, it's on
On the west side.
On the left side. This was Dad's invitation to the fire department. And so in 1954, as a machinist mate first class, he was trained in fire work on the ship. Everybody was trained in fire on the ship. And so he joined the fire department in 1954 and was a member of the fire department for at least 25 years here in Brodhead, Volunteer Fire Department. And the last few years had the fire things going off in our house. I mean, so in the middle of the night you would hear the fire call come in. So over on the left side you're going to see, that was one of the few pictures we have of the Southside Grocery. This was about 1954, and that's the coffee section, which was also where the bread section was in the grocery store at the time. There was a porch on the front of the store where Dad would bring out 100-pound bags of potatoes. Now, I don't know if any of you ever bought or carried a 100-pound bag of potatoes, but it was my job as his son to peck the potatoes. So you took potatoes from a 100-pound bag and you put them in a peck. I love you, a bushel and a peck. And my job was to peck potatoes. And so it was really fun because just as soon as I'd get done with one and get ready to go play, guess who would bring in another 100-pound bag? It was awful. And then you'll see Mom and Dad and my sister in a photo here in April of 1958. Sue would have been 5 or 6 at the time. In the 50s continued, we bought a home on 1001 16th Street, 1 block away from the store. So we finally moved out of the grocery store and bought a home in the early 50s. 1956 we had the Centennial. You'll see a number of pictures in here of the Centennial. 1958 we began plans for a new 10,000 square foot supermarket in the vacant lot immediately north of the grocery store. So there was a vacant lot north of the grocery store. That vacant lot housed an old barn. Well, I would have been 8, 9, 10 years old at the time. Do you know how much fun an old barn was to be and how much fun I had with that, and how upset I was that Dad was going to take the barn away and put a grocery store there, by all means, doing something with that. And so I want to talk to you about building the brand new 1960s grocery store. Remember at the time you've got a number of grocery stores in Brodhead. They winnowed down to about 3 at that point, and 3 or 4, and so it was a risk to build a new 10,000 square foot grocery store, 100 by 100. It was a risk to build it. And And so the banks backed Dad at the time, and all of a sudden we ended up not having enough money to pave over the parking lot where the old building sat. And so one of the city fathers came to Dad and said, Dean, I'll give you the $10,000 you need to put in a parking lot so that you can start your new store. And Dad paid him back. And I don't want to say we've lost that, but I'd like it not to be just in somebody's memory that somebody was kind to somebody else who was doing business at the time. A lot of you come from that same circumstance, whether it be on the farm or your own business or whatever, but there were people that believed in Dad at that time, and so that was good. Frank Engelbretson painted the old covered bridge on the grocery store, and so you'll see that. If you go to the post office today, that's still on the side of the building. Part of it is gone, but most of the painting is still there, not going to be taken down off of that wall. But the painting that used to be above the meat department at the Southside Grocery is hanging in the room, what do you call it?
Museum office.
The office. It's hanging in the office. And that was one of the Frank Engelbretson paintings that was above the meat department in the grocery store. One of the things that Dad wanted to do was to highlight Brodhead people and to give them a stage to be able to do stuff. And so when Frank Engelbretson painted the old covered bridge on the side of her van, everywhere that van went, people saw Frank Engelbretson paintings. That's neat. It's good to do that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to the Century story. Now, I've talked an awful lot. Do any of you have questions about where we've been so far?
Exactly where was the old store?
The old store is where the parking lot of the post office is today.
That's what I thought.
So the post office parking lot is where the store was. So they tore the store down in order to put the parking lot in.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else?
Facing Highway 11?
Yeah, it was still Highway 11, you bet. Yep. And as a matter of fact, with the old grocery store, if you can see, out in front of the old grocery store, there are gas pumps. That was a Conoco station. Those are Conoco gas pumps. And to tell you just a brief vignette about that, those gas pumps used to get very important people come by to buy their gas there. Not many people in the room are going to remember a wrestler named Gorgeous George. And Gorgeous George used to wrestle in Rockford and then go wrestle in Milwaukee. And he would drive up through Brodhead and he would buy gas from Dad, the gas pumps. And so Dad got to be friends with Gorgeous George. You can't make this stuff up. And so it was fun to know that about Dad and about the gas station. That also is where, well, I won't tell you that one. Any other questions? Yes?
You may have said this, but I missed it. What was the name of the ship your dad was on?
It's called the Patrol Craft Escort Rescue, PCER 852.
So it wasn't a named ship like the Intrepid?
No, it's not a named ship. There were 3 of those ships in the Pacific in World War II, the 851, the 852, and the 853. And so those ships, their job was to take wounded soldiers from the beaches and do one of the 3 things that I talked about. So, and later in years, Dad's crew, as you'll see there, actually got together and they would get together annually. And so I had the pleasure of being a part of that and getting to meet the crew that were still there. And it was a lot of fun to get to meet them. And they would say, "Oh, your Dean's almost wasn't." Yeah, almost wasn't. But it was good to see them get back together because they went through an awful lot of tragedy. So, by the way, Dr. Malott, who was the physician on the ship, used to be lashed to the operating table for up to 15 hours at a time. So he would be at the operating table and his legs would actually be lashed to the table. So he didn't have to spend energy standing up. That he didn't have to, when the ship moved, he didn't have to move with the ship. He would just be lashed to the table. I can't imagine operating for 12 to 15 hours at a time. And yet that's what he did. Neat guy, by the way. He delivered the presentation at Truman's library. All right, any other questions? If not, I'll move on.
Sandy, what was the protection for this boat from the kamikazes?
It was minimal, and one of the things that I could read to you is the fact that this ship had no aircraft radar. That ought to scare the wits out of you. Because if they don't have any aircraft radar, they have no way of knowing when the kamikazes are coming in until they see them. And that was a surprising piece of this, but it was not equipped with aircraft radar. It was effectively equipped to be able to keep wounded soldiers moving through the process.
They had just a few guns, but that was.
Yeah, very few guns.
2 or 3.
And so they had no big guns at all. They were not equipped like any other ship would have been. So, all right, let's continue. So you see Mom and Dad here. This is one of the few times Dad wore his uniform. This was at the new house on 16th Street. And then you see the building, the beginnings of the building in 1960, where they were actually laying girders and laying cinder block, etc. Dad with his good friend Ray Tim, and Dad and Ray and Margaret and Mom used to go out to dinner almost every Saturday night, and did for years and years until 1968, when David was killed in Vietnam, and they didn't go out together much after that at all. It was bad. You'll see here as well. George Robinson, I want to talk to you a little bit about George Robinson. His daughters are here today, Barb and Beverly. But Doc was his nickname. And Doc Robinson, I asked him, how did you get your nickname? George wasn't a tall guy at all. He was a little guy. And George and I used to deliver, in 1960, we delivered groceries to people's homes. And we put the groceries in their refrigerators or in their cupboards if they asked us to do so. In the 1960s, all right? Now, that wouldn't happen today. But George and I had a lot of fun together. I learned a lot of things from George. I'm going to tell you, Beverly, I'm not trying to hold you up here, but
We know.
she already knows the joke I'm going to tell you. Do you know how you catch fish? You take and you put a can of peas on the water, and when the fish comes up to take a pee, you hit him with a hammer. It was a good joke to a kid. George and I were good friends, as well as he worked for Dad for a number of years, and you'll see one of the pictures with George in his retirement. In the 1960s, we built the Superstore that you saw, the 10,000 foot one. Margaret Tim, as I recall, was a manager, at least for a little while in there. And so Margaret was a manager until then. Dad bought J.B. Kristoff's grocery store in Albany. And Danny Weber was there, and Danny worked for Dad. But J.B. Kristoff had a general store in Albany, and Dad bought that general store.
Christopher's.
Christopher?
Yes.
Christopher's. J.B. Christopher, okay, I'm sorry. One of the times that I had the first, I guess I can only have one, the only accident I had with the van that we had, I went over to the Albany store one time in the winter to pick up 90 dozen eggs. And as I was coming back outside of Albany by where the campground is now, I hit a patch of ice and went sailing into a tree. et cetera, et cetera. And Dad came to get me, and as we get ready to go back, he said, okay, now you're gonna drive back to the grocery store, because you're gonna get back on that horse and ride. And afterwards, we found out that out of the 90 dozen eggs, I only broke 3 dozen. So, I don't know that he took solace in that, because I ruined the car, but that was it. So we bought the Royal Blue Store in Orfordville with Emerson Kessler. And so we bought the Royal Blue Store that was on Center Avenue. I don't know if you know much about Orfordville, but that was there. We bought the Northside Grocery from George. Dad was one of the first people to put in a warehouse food store. And we saw a lot of warehouse food stores coming in the 70s and 80s. And so you'd find Costco and Sam's Club and all of those kinds of things. Well, we did one in the 1960s. And I still remember a couple of days where, as we were looking at those, doing that store and stocking it, Dad would buy semi-loads full of 100-pound bags of potatoes. And so you would take the semi-load of 100-pound bags of potatoes, you put them in the warehouse. Well, geez, there's a lot of potatoes to move when you're moving 100-pound bags. And so we would get a couple of the big and brawny and beefy high school students. I remember Bill Penguin doing it, Jim Iverson doing it, I did it, several others did it, and you would carry 100-pound bags of potatoes from the back of that semi into the warehouse. But the warehouse was something that caught on, but we were just years ahead of the scope. Our family moved down to West 7th Avenue at that point, so we moved out of the house on 16th Street. We built the laundromat, and the laundromat was on the back half of the warehouse at the time. It's now, the laundromat was where the Brodhead Dance Academy is today. So for those of you that know that. And then we had an APCO store. APCO was big at the time in Brodhead. Lots of people worked for APCO, and Dad got to a point where he could buy seconds from the APCO store, and we sold them out of the warehouse, and so it was a lot of fun. So you'll see Bill Pingree with my mom, and I don't know who the guy is close to the ice cream, so I can't recognize him. Down in the lower corner you'll see a guy with a cigar, that's my dad, and you'll see Dara Gard there. The same picture. And then on the far left, the Teely Popcorn Company out of northern Illinois. And you'll see Sandy Peterson was helping out the Teely Popcorn guys. And you'll see Kenitha Edwards with Ann Capel. And Ann was one of the ladies that worked for us at the time, and delightful lady, and she was just as kind and sweet as you could be. You'll see here again the Northside Grocery, and during the winter time, the Southside Grocery opening, etc. In the 1970s, we moved a house from north of the store to West 2nd Avenue. My sister lived in the house at the time, and we were going to build, at the time, the liquor store. And so we needed to have that part of the property, and so we decided to move the house. And so there are pictures here at the museum showing that house traveling down the street, and moved the entire house to West 2nd Avenue. We expanded the footprint of the new store, so if you envision the original building was 10,000 square feet, 100 by 100. Well, then if you go the other way, we went out 100 by 50, so it became an L shape. And then when we built the liquor store on, it became finishing out the rest of the L shape. And so that's where the liquor store was, and that's where the Russell Law offices are today. And just Margaret Tim managed the liquor store at the time, and so there was Mom and Dad used to take a number of the folks that worked for Mom and Dad. Everybody was like family at our store, and so when Mom and Dad had the opportunity to take folks to a nice place, they did. And so here you see Donna, Judy, Moss, and George, and Yuli Robinson, and Dolores, and someone else in the back. I don't remember who. And then my mom and dad used to go to CERTCO meetings, the Independent Grocers Association. They went to those meetings nationally and internationally. And so this shows them at a meeting, having a good time. While they were at these meetings, you had the opportunity to meet people. Do you see the guy in the white? Do you remember his name? Liberace. Mom and Dad met Liberace. And so this is a picture of Mom with Liberace, and we have a picture with Dad as well. And then off to the other one, you'll see Stan and Ann Everson and Mom and Dad. Dad used to like bow ties, and I don't know if you can see it, but in the Southside Grocery, when we began in 1960, these were the bow ties we wore. And these bow ties were clip-ons, but it says Southside Grocery. And so when you came to the Southside Grocery, you saw somebody in a white shirt and a clip-on bow tie. And that's what we did. So that's why the museum has my bow tie that we had at that time. In the 1980s, let me back up to the late 70s. You're going to see some things here now, and I'm going to talk to you about things that really nobody knows, except me and my family. Dad loved being an independent businessman. Loved being able to do what he wanted to do on his own with the grocery business. But in the late 70s, Dad had a marketing company do a marketing study in Brodhead, and we effectively asked the question, if someone builds a brand new supermarket, will the other grocery store be able to continue? And the answer was no. And so at that point in the late 70s, we began to make plans to move and build a brand new grocery store across the street from the Southside Grocery. And that brand new grocery store was going to be a Century store. And Dad had never wanted to be, Dad had never wanted to be a franchise owner. He did that with the NP, didn't like it, always wanted to be able to do what he wanted to do. And I'm going to tell you in just a minute how he did things differently than Century, just so he could show independence. But it was known as Peterson's Century. And so we bought Steers Century from Norvell and Sid Steer. We finalized plans with the Century Corporation to become a franchisee-owned store, but it would be Peterson's Century. Peterson Century opened, and the reason I said cheese from Greene County, when you're a franchise group like McDonald's or some other place, you do what McDonald's tells you in McDonald's way, and you will earn this amount of money that McDonald's wants you to earn. That's the way it works. Well, if you want to throw a wrench in the cooking here, then Dad always wanted to highlight, and did always highlight in the Southside Grocery, cheese from Greene County. Always, always. We went out to the cheese factories every weekend to get cheese to bring in to the Southside Grocery to sell. And that's, as a matter of fact, how I learned about drive a car. I was going out to the cheese factories with Dad on Saturday mornings. And so it was at that point that Dad said, I'm going to have local Greene County cheese. Well, if you imagine you sell cheese as the Century store, well, we're going to screw up our margins here because you're going to be selling stuff we don't even have in our system. Well, but that's what Dad wanted to do. It was different, and he said, I'm highlighting Greene County cheese. So for any of you that ever remember the initial opening of the Century store, you will see a whole cooler of nothing but Greene County cheese. Dad's way of saying, that's what I want to do. I want to highlight Greene County. The post office was rented at that point the post office space was rented. Doyle and Portermore bought the liquor store, and the hardware store was bought by McGinty at the time. And so they occupied all of the space of what was the old Southside grocery, the warehouse, and the liquor store. The Century Store was subsequently sold to Phil Tim, longtime employee and manager of the Southside Grocery, and then Dad retired. So I'm going to give you a peek behind the curtain, and I know you can't see this very well, but it's up on the table up here. In 1979, the Century Store gave us a perspective on how much the equipment would cost to go into the new Century Store and how much we would have to have in terms of supplies at the new store. Not product, nothing, this didn't have anything to do with selling. This had to do with what do you have to supply the grocery store. And so the number on the bottom of this page in 1979 is $245,000. That's a tremendous amount of risk to take coming into Brodhead at the time, because the store wasn't even complete. And here's a bill for $245,000. You can see it over here. And so that gives you a sense of when you're a businessman, and I'm going to say like my dad, when you're a businessman, you take risk. And that's a lot of risk to take. Back in 1980, who had $245,000? Houses cost $60,000. It was different back then. And so that was a peek behind the curtain. Here's some of the stuff going in, some of the people at the store. I see Shorty Rushheisen there. I don't see who the other guys are. You'll see some of the aisles. That's my dad with my son Andrew at the time, and Liz and my sister Sue, who unfortunately just passed away this past December. And so it was hard because I'm the only one left now. But Sue was every bit involved with the grocery store at that time as she could be. You'll see Phil Tim, and you'll see Mom and Dad and Doc in Doc's retirement photo. And that was George retiring from the grocery store. I can't tell you how much people meant to our family at the time. Stan Everson is here, and Stan meant an awful lot to Mom and Dad. And Danny Weber in the back, and some of the rest of you who worked, Dean and others who worked for Dad. Just over time, how important you were to our family and how well we could develop because of it. Dad loved hiring people out of high school. And I don't know how many of you remember back that far, but Bill Pengler and Jim Iverson both worked at the same time for my dad. And there was a lot of training that went on. You know, Dad would train people that when you're walking to someplace, you carry something, and when you walk away from someplace, you carry something else. You're always walking to and from someplace, doing something. You're not just idly walking between places. And it was hard for a lot of kids to learn, but it was fun, and he loved teaching young people how to do that. I remember a story of Bill Pengler, especially in the new store, the 1960 store. Bill didn't know squat about produce. This is an apple, this is an orange. He just didn't know anything about produce. And there was a lady that came up to him one day and she said, "No, sir, are these apples delicious?" And he looked at her and he said, "They sure are, man." And those are the stories you don't forget. I mean, they sure are, man. And Bill Pengler went on to be very successful. Do you know what he did after he left Brodhead? He owned and managed 3 different McDonald's out in southeastern Wisconsin, Lake Geneva, Williams Bay area, and did very well. And Jim Iverson went on to own Chevrolet dealerships. I bought my 1971 Olds 442 from Jim. So. Now, there are social and community things that I want to talk briefly about, and then we'll call it a wrap, or you'll ask more questions. Dad joined the 40 and 8 in Monroe, 40 men and 8 horses, 40 mules and 8 horses, 40 mules. I had it clear once. 40 mules and 8 men.
No.
40, who said no? Whoever said no, there you go. I had it right the first time, huh?
Yeah, 40 men.
Yeah, 40 men and 8 mules. And the 40 and 8, and he had just come back from the war. He also joined the American Legion. Mom stayed at home with us. One of the children that was quite a handful, you know. Unfortunately, you know. 1950s, Dad joined a lot of organizations to support his adopted town. We saw earlier that he joined the fire department. He was a charter member of the JCs, charter member of the Lions Club. He became the first outstanding young man in Brodhead by the JCs, and he became the first outstanding old man by the JCs. So he had some bookends there. He was in the Legion. For those of you that graduated from high school in the 1960s and maybe even early 70s from Brodhead High School, you will find my dad's name on your high school diploma. And so that's kind of neat because he was clerk of the school board. It's another story, but I will tell you about the time that Dad and I went to Art Christensen's home and said, would you please sell us some land right across the street from your current farm to build the brand new 1960s high school. And Dad, as a member, as clerk of the school board, was to open that door and walk through it. Mom was working alongside Dad at the store, was president of the VFW Auxiliary. She was in the Sweet Adelines. They used to come to our house to sing all of the time. That was a lot of fun. She was in the Ladies Auxiliary at St. Clair Hospital in Monroe. For those of you that don't know, my mom, early in some years, was an alcoholic. She became, later on in life, she broke her alcohol anonymity, and for the last 25 years of her life was completely sober and helped women at St. Clair Hospital, 4 o'clock in the morning, get a telephone call, Mary, could you come and help this lady? She's drunk. And my mom was a saint as it related to that. And it was Dan Markham, old Dan Markham, who helped my mom with alcoholism. We joined St. Peter's Lutheran Church, developed Saturday night routine that I told you about, going out with Ray and Margaret. In the 60s to 80s, Dad was elected to the CERTCO Board of Directors. That was the group in Madison that sent us groceries all of the time. And so we would get, and Dean, no, you can't tell the story, okay? But we would get 500 or 600 boxes of groceries at a time in a couple of times a week. And so when you had groceries in, it was all hands on deck. Everybody was there and busy working and stuff. And so that was it. And Dad was always involved with making Brodhead a better place to be. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories that indicate stuff about Mom and Dad that you may not know. Do we have a couple of pictures left? Yeah, this is Dad with Don Connon and me. Dad's retirement from the Bank of Brodhead. He was on the board at the Bank of Brodhead for a number of years. And that's one of the best pictures I have of my mom and dad. Just sweet and relaxed. So if we could turn on the lights. We're good? All right, I've got some more things to say, but questions. What questions do you have about anything you've heard tonight? Yes, great.
Can I tell a quick anecdote?
Yes.
I was a college freshman majoring in business, 19 years old. I was brilliant. And I saw your dad in the bank, and I said, you got this old couple, he knew who I was talking about, that brings produce that they grow at their home place, and they sell it out of your parking lot. I says, Dean, every dollar they make is a dollar out of your pocket. He says, you ever hear of a man named Jesus?
Greg and Grandpa Ralph were good people. They were good people. And you know, as you read through, I'm going to read a little bit about what someone said about Dad, but I can tell you stories about people that knew our family that Dad would pay their semester tuition at the university. Dad would pay their semester tuition at the university so they could go on to school. I can tell you one lady who went on and got her nursing degree that Dad helped to do exactly that, who worked for us. Dad was, and Mom too, to a fault, they would help other people. And the Janesville Gazette a few years ago had a picture of Dad standing outside the Bank of Brodhead, looking over the square, and he's got 2 bags of groceries, one in each arm, and it was talking about what he would do helping in the city of Brodhead. I can't tell you how many Christmases and Thanksgivings Dad and I went around to people's homes, poor people. You know who we're talking about, poor people, who worked hard and weren't going to have a good Thanksgiving and Christmas. And Dad would take one of the stories that I heard after Dad died was one of my classmates, a female, one of my classmates, called me up and said, I want to tell you a story about your dad that you will never know and nobody would know unless I told you. I said, what's that? And she was from a poor family. Dad was a hardworking welder. They didn't have anything, just a wonderful family. And so she said, well, I want you to know there was a Christmas where there was a doll in the window at the Gamble store downtown. And I told my mom I really wanted that doll for Christmas. And I knew they didn't have the money to get me that doll. And on Christmas Eve night, my dad came up walking with 2 bags full of groceries, and on top of one of those bags was that doll. And she said, I'll never forget the kindness that your parents did for me. I don't think that's just small town stuff. I hope it's not. I mean, I hope it's really what we're all about. But, you know, that's the kind of thing that Mom and Dad distilled in folks. We had people who went on and went very successfully into other businesses. Stan Everson here went up and did a business up in Poynette, Wisconsin, a grocery store, and did very well for years in the grocery business in Poynette. Phil Tim did very well after buying the Century store from Dad for 10 years and until it sold to become the Piggly Wiggly. I mean, there are people that went on to do very well that worked for Dad at the time. And as I think about it, and I'm not trying to be melancholy and make it be more than it is, because everybody, you ride your own horse, you know? To a great degree, you make your own luck. But I do remember a couple of stories, particularly that I had with Dad, about me. And I'll just give you a brief snippet. I went on to Indiana University, got a PhD. And so in 1979, 1980, Dad and I started talking about whether or not I was going to come back to Brodhead and take over the grocery business. Imagine that. Come back to Brodhead, take over the grocery business, step into those shoes. Holy cow. And he looked at me and with all of the sincerity that he could muster, he said, son, he said, I built this store for me and for our community, not for you. That was some of the best advice I had. And I went out and got a PhD. I finished up. And he said, you don't want to have a PhD in the grocery business. I mean, you're not right. So that was good advice. And as parents and men, you know, sometimes you give that advice to your children. I want to close with just this one piece. I didn't write it, but it's in the Brodhead paper, 2005. And I want to read this to you, if you could hold this one more time. Then we're done. And we'll ask a lot more questions. I want you to tell some stories. This is from George Blakesley. Do any of you remember that name? There's a big guy in town who runs around in a reddish van with clear windows. You can't miss it. When nothing's in his van, you can catch him at the Senior Citizen when it opens first thing in the morning. Few people know that Dean Peterson is one of those special people who does a lot of works behind the scene without recognition. One person he has helped along life's path is Charlie Scrivens. Charlie could often be seen riding around his town on the lawn tractor, going from one side to another to mow or to clean up leaves. Dean provided housing and care for Charlie these many years until there became a need for Charlie to move to the nursing facility. For those of you that don't know, Dad was Charlie's, he was responsible. Guardian. Dean is not a local son, but he's lived in Brodhead community for many years, grew up in Fort Atkinson, et cetera, et cetera. At one time, Dean probably knew more people in Brodhead community than anyone else. I think that's probably true. Always he was aware of the needs of others and quietly contributed to their welfare. Charlie Scriven, as mentioned above, was one of those who benefited from Dean's charity. For all of his giving, we used to kid Dean about owning half a Brodhead. He would only respond by saying, "It's all in your imagination. I'm only doing my part for the benefit of my community." Dean is definitely a community guy. In fact, he recently donated an empty lot for the EMS to use, since the lot lies next door to the EMS station. And by the way, he also donated Charlie's house so the fire department could burn it down. Not burn it down badly, learn how to do that. Not long ago, Dean retired as the director of the Bank of Brodhead for health reasons. He still continues to be active in helping his community. The next time you see Dean Peterson, just say to him, "Thanks, Dean, for all you've given to Brodhead." That's my mom and dad, and I couldn't sum it up any better than George did. It was really nice for him to write that letter about my dad. So, I'm open for questions. It's been an hour. That's good. I don't, yeah, I didn't notice anybody sleeping, so that was good. I'm happy to answer any other questions, or if you have a comment about Dad at the grocery store, I'd be happy to hear it. Stan, you got anything in mind? If you do, you gotta come up here.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do that.
Stan Everson worked for Dad in the meat department. I just want you to know that this guy has swallowed more oysters raw than anybody else I know in my life. And he used to ask the breadman, "If I swallow an oyster whole, will you give me $1?" And the breadman would say yes, and so there he was.
You touched on so many things that I hope the local things down to the regression part.
Here.
Yeah, I graduated from high school in '58. Went to meat school, Toledo. And I got back and I kind of kicked around a while. Milwaukee and Waukesha, and I decided I didn't like the big cities, so I took a job with Claire Field over in Shoulder. And I thought it was going pretty good, and I was there about 3 months, and he said, "I'm going to have to lay you off." And so what did I do? And he said, "Not a thing." He said, "You're everything right." And he said, "We're just not doing the volume." He said, "I'm going to have to do the cutting myself." And he says, "I'm going to give you 2 weeks severance, basically, look for a job." And I was getting married in August, and this was in March and probably June when he laid me off. And so the way I went looking for a job, and I got one with Al Fox down in Beloit, and was there about the same amount of time, and it was a union store. He had 4 stores, and they were union stores, and he had to, he was going to close one of them up. So he had a guy there that he needed to find a place for. So I was the last hire, so I was the one they bumped. But he said, I'm gonna offer you a job to work at a grocery. So I think I better take that. So I did, and it wasn't too long, and I found out that Dean was gonna build a store. Well, the first time the bulldozer went across the ground up there, I was over looking for a job. No, he says, I got an older guy in line, and he says, he's got a lot of experience, and he went on and on, and I didn't give up. I stayed right with it. I was in his hind pocket all the time. The store started going up, and all of a sudden, everything was up at the windows, and they started moving into shelving. I'm right over there helping him put the shelving up, and move equipment in, and I kept after him, and I just wouldn't let up on him. Finally, he hired me, and I think he overlooked that old fellow that I don't think he existed. Anyway, it was, they had a guy come in, and a photographer come in, and took a bunch of pictures and were getting ready for the grand opening. And we didn't think anything about it, but a few months later, some customer come in, and they had a magazine with either a Crime Stopper or a detective or something like that. And there was an article in it about merchants who were taking advantage of cheating people and stuff. And here's a picture of Big Dean and Margaret Tim. And Dean was standing behind the meat counter, and he's got a big piece of round steak, and he's showing Margaret as a potential customer. And she was just standing there, and he looked at it, and the eyes were blacked out on both of them, and it was just an article that, well, thievery, you know, and it didn't have anything to do with Dean, but it was just a picture. And he was a freelance photographer, so he sold these pictures all over, and this magazine company apparently bought that picture for that article. And Dean was offended. He said, trying to make a living, he says, and he said, they're making me out to be a crook. And he said, I'm not a crook, he says. I laughed, and he wasn't funny to Dean. Like Sandy said, you know, Dean was really civic-minded, and he belonged to a lot of service organizations in town, and did a lot for a lot of people. And he was in the Lions Club and fire department, as Sandy said, school board. And I don't know, for some reason, my mom was in her shopping one day, and I don't know how they got talking about graduation coming up, and she says, yeah, she said, that kid of mine, she said, I don't know what I'm going to do. She said, he doesn't take school very serious. I'm afraid he's not going to graduate. And Dean says, well, he said, don't say anything to him, but he says, he's going to graduate, because he says, I signed his diploma last week. Then, after he got working with Dean, you know, for, I don't know, it must have been a couple, 3 years, I don't remember exactly, but I was having trouble getting rid of pork trimming, and so I said to Dean, I said, how about we make some bratwurst? Dean says, these Norwegians around here said they're normal bratwurst. So I said, well, we can try it, you know. And so we bought a stuffing horn, new casing, and some seasoning, and we started making them, and it really took off, and kind of created a monster there. So it got to the point where we're making 150 pounds a week, and on holiday weekends we'd eat more than that. And and he was always a promoter. He promoted the sandwiches, cheese, and he bought this 1,000-pound horn of cheese, and called it a horn, fit on top of a pallet. It was that big around, it was at least that high. We tried to figure out how we're going to merchandise, how to get rid of it if we bought it. And so we decided that we'd get a panel wire, and we scored it around the edge, because it had cheesecloths with like wax on it. We made a little thing, we cut about a 4-inch cut all the way around it so we could get the panel wire in it. And Don Moss was working with that time, and so him and I would pull that wire through there, and lift that top off and set it aside, and we'd cut another one. We'd take that one out, and we'd cut that one up in pieces, take it in the meat room and wrap it, and we'd put the first piece back on top so it wouldn't dry out, and we'd set all these on the top, and every time we put low, we'd do it again. And I don't remember ever losing any of it. I think we sold the whole thing. I was surprised. And then Sandy mentioned that, Dean helped other, people, and he helped Ann and I with, we rented a house right next to the store, right in front of where the dance studio is now, and it's moved. They moved it since over behind the Lutheran church there. And he bought a house down on 16th Street, and the person owed him some money, and he used to extend credit, and owed him quite a bit. And so the guy had his house for sale, and so Dean bought it. And when he did the closing, he took that money off for his groceries that he owed him. And I said, well, how about Ann and I rent that from you? He said, why don't you buy it? And I said, well, I'm a little financially embarrassed right now. And, so he said, oh, don't worry about that. He said, we'll see what we can do. So we ended up, we put the money back onto it and sold it to me, and we worked out a little deal with the bank, and we had a house, and he had his money for his groceries, so it worked out real good. And Sandy too also mentioned about him, helping the less fortunate at Christmas time, and Thanksgiving too. I remember him doing that, taking groceries to different people that were too well off. And we had a place, this area in town, they used to call it Deeganville, and I don't know if anybody remembers that. And, well, I lived down there when I was down there. I lived down the back of the schools down in that area. And he come back one time, and I sorted with a tear in his eye. I went in there with groceries, he said they got a dirt floor. He said. So, he was good at Christmas time to his employees. We got a nice bonus at Christmas time, which was good when you got 3 little kids that want every toy in the service catalog. And Don Moss and I would joke back and forth. As soon as we get the check, we'd say, hey, how much was it? How much did you get? And I'd say, I'd tell him $25 more than what I got. He says, yeah, that's what I got. I know, we did that to each other. And then also, when I worked for Dean for 10 years in the meat department, and the last year I was there, I come out and worked in the grocery department with him. And he was a merchandiser. He had some product, it was like High C, but it was an off-brand thing, and he bought more than he should. And so he said, we got to get rid of this. So we built this big display on the end of the thing, and I'm looking at it, and I said, I don't know. I said, Dean, I said, I think if we bottle some water, I think somebody would buy it. And now you look at the stores, and you got half a mile full of water. Well, Dean and I missed the boat on that one. I was in business up there for about 11 years, and I just got burnt out, tired of it, and I decided to go to Arizona. And went down there and kicked around a little bit for a couple of years, and I finally landed a job with the Air Force at Davis Mountain Air Force Base. And I was there for 15 years, I guess. And I finally retired out of there. And that was the second best job I ever had in my life. And first place would have been Southside Grocery. I guess that's about all I can say. He mentioned Mr. George Robinson, your 2 daughters are here, and I couldn't pick you out in that crowd. Barbie said babysit with my kids back in the day. One of Gloria's going to be 62 this year. Luann's going to be 60.
Well, listen, any other comments about Dad or Mom? I'm happy to hear what you have to say. Yeah, thanks for coming. It's been a wonderful opportunity to present the journey from the Southside Grocery to the Century to now the Piggly Wiggly. That's been very good. I'm glad that we had that opportunity as a family to be involved with Brodhead. I grew up in Brodhead schools. I had a Brodhead background in education. This was a great place to grow up and live and to experience. So those of you that are still here in Brodhead, don't give up what you've got. You know, God takes us different paths in our life, and He's just taken me to a different place. But don't give up what you've got here, because there have been a lot of things about Brodhead that are wonderful and great, great memories. So, thank you very much.